Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. Desmond Tutu. Brain fog, fatigue, shortness of breath, tachycardia. More than 200 reported symptoms so far. Yet, for many of us, most standard medical tests came back normal. While COVID may feel like a distant memory for much of the world, for some of us, the story didn't end when the infection did. The trauma is still unfolding in a diagnosis with no known prognosis. My name is Joe, and I've been living with long COVID since the very beginning of the pandemic. Long Haul Hope isn't a medical podcast. It's a place for encouragement, connection, and solidarity. Because no matter where we find ourselves in the long haul, there is one thing we still have control over: hope. Welcome to Long Haul Hope. Hello, friends, and welcome back to Long Haul Hope. Have you ever had the very best of intentions, only to have long COVID completely derail your plans? Maybe you've had a day where you woke up feeling a little better. You thought, maybe today's the day. Maybe today I'll finally get caught up. Maybe today I'll tackle that project I've been putting off. Maybe today I'll reconnect with friends, clean the house, get out of the house, or work on something that's been sitting on the back burner for months. And then long COVID reminds you that it still has a vote. Sometimes living with long COVID feels like playing a never-ending game of red light, green light. You start moving forward. Green light. You begin making plans again. Green light. You even allow yourself to think that maybe you're making progress. Green light. And then suddenly, red light. Although, if I'm being honest, most of the last few years haven't felt like red light, green light. They felt more like red light, yellow light, and occasionally green light. The spirit is willing, but the body keeps reminding us that we don't get to move at the speed that we like. And if you've been wondering where I've been for the last 3 years since season 1 ended, well, that's part of the answer. I never intended to be gone this long. When I first started Long Haul Hope, I envisioned weekly episodes. Instead, they became sporadic. But even then, I never expected to stop after only 8 episodes. I thought I'd take a break, regroup, recover a little more, and then come back for season 2. In fact, I even recorded a teaser announcing my return. But the problem was that life had other plans. For the first couple of years, it actually felt like I was making progress. I had started a beta blocker for the tachycardia. I was taking low-dose naltrexone, which seemed to help. I learned how to pace myself a little better. The crashes were becoming less frequent and less severe. Recovery still felt slow, but it felt like I was moving in the right direction. Hope was growing. And then, in early 2025, I got reinfected. And suddenly it felt like I was learning how to navigate this illness all over again. The fatigue became more disruptive. The crashes became more frequent. Activities I'd slowly worked my way back towards suddenly became much harder again. And eventually that journey led somewhere I never expected. Early retirement. Not by choice. It's now been more than 6 months since my last day in the office. And the strange thing is that when I left the office that day, I didn't know it would be my last. I thought I was stepping away temporarily. I thought 12 weeks of FMLA medical leave would give me time to recover and regroup. Instead, I found myself in a season of uncertainty unlike anything I'd experienced before. My future felt unclear. My career, my lifelong career in human services, was suddenly over, unceremoniously. My sense of purpose felt shaken. And for the first time in my adult life, I had more free time than I knew what to do with, but very, very little energy to fill it. Church helped. Support groups helped. Weekly therapy helped. But if I'm honest, there were some difficult months in there. Months filled with anxiety, months filled with depression, months spent wondering what comes next. And there was another emotion lurking beneath the surface: shame. Not just because I was sick, but because I had disappeared. Because I had made promises to myself and to others that I hadn't followed through on. Because that gap between good intentions and actual execution is a struggle I've wrestled with for much of my life, long before long COVID entered the picture. Shame probably deserves its own episode someday. But somewhere in the middle of all that uncertainty, something unexpected happened. I began sharing more openly about my experiences living with long COVID. I became more active on social media. I became more consistently involved in support groups. And then I was invited to participate in a research project and record a short story about what it's like living with long COVID in a rural community. It was only a few minutes long, but sitting down to organize my thoughts and record my voice reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. I still have a voice. Long COVID has taken a lot from me. It took a career I loved. It took abilities I once took for granted. It altered plans and expectations. But it didn't take my voice. And maybe that's the thing I've been learning over these last few years. When we're focused on everything we've lost, we sometimes forget to ask what remains. What remains that can still be used? What remains that can still make a difference? For me, the answer was my voice. I can still tell stories. I can still encourage. I can still advocate. I can still raise awareness. I can still help people living with long COVID feel seen, heard, believed, and understood. And that brings me back to a story we discussed in season 1, all the way back at the beginning. The story of the Chilean miners. 33 miners became trapped underground after a mine collapse in 2010. For 17 days, the world didn't know whether they were alive. But just as significantly, the miners didn't know whether anyone was coming. They didn't know if rescue efforts were underway. They didn't know if anyone had found signs of life. They didn't know how their story would end. They only knew they were trapped in the darkness with diminishing resources. But eventually, rescuers received the now famous note confirming this. And it read, "We are well in the shelter, all 33 of us." And I've always loved that message, not because it says, "I survived," but because it says, "we survived." Collectively, together. And when we tell that story, it's easy to imagine a single heroic figure carrying everybody else through the darkness. But I suspect the reality was far more human. I suspect there were days when some of the miners felt stronger and others felt weaker. Days when one person's hope carried another. Days when courage was shared. Days when fear was shared. Days when the burden was shared. And yet, together, they kept the collective hope alive. I've thought about that story a lot over the last 3 years, especially because hope hasn't often felt like a roaring fire. Most of the time, it's felt like a single ember glowing in the darkness. A campfire ember on a cold night doesn't provide much warmth, doesn't provide much light. In fact, if all you can focus on is what it isn't, it can seem almost insignificant. But an ember is fundamentally different from ashes. Ashes are what's left when the fire is gone. An ember, however small, is the possibility of fire, of warmth, of heat, of light. And maybe that's what hope looks like sometimes. not certainty, not guarantees, not pretending everything is fine. My faith reminds me that hope is so much more than wishful thinking. Hope is trusting that God is still at work, even when I can't see the full picture, even when I don't understand the timing, even when the path forward remains unclear. And sometimes the role of a community like this one, like us long haulers, is simply to help protect one another's embers when our own are struggling to burn. And so, as we begin season 2 of Long Haul Hope, that's part of what I'd like this podcast to become. We'll talk about living with long COVID. We'll talk about tools and technology that make life a little easier. We'll talk about identity, purpose, grief, faith, resilience, and adaptation. We'll highlight resources, research, and reasons for hope. And most importantly, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from the person who feels like they've been sitting alone in the darkness, waiting for any sight or sound or sign at all that anybody else understands. And I want to hear from the person who has somehow managed to nurture their spark of hope through it all. Because I suspect every one of us has something to contribute, however small. Every one of us has a story worth telling. And every one of us carries a spark that may help someone else keep going. The last few years haven't gone according to my plans. Maybe yours haven't either. But the ember is still there. The spark is still alive. And while a fading ember may not provide much light or much heat, it still carries within it the potential to become something more. Because it only takes a spark to kindle a mighty fire. And as long as that spark continues to burn, the story, my story, your story, our story, isn't over. Thank you for listening. Long Haul Hope is more than just a podcast. It's a community. If you have a story you'd like to tell, a lesson from the long haul, or a spark of hope to share, please email me at joe@longhaulhope.com. Your experience could help someone else find a little hope on their journey. Together, we're stronger.